Welcome to Friday. Welcome to the Week in Review. This is
Hi there.
Hi, nice to have you again. And KUOW is a newscaster, Paige Browning. Thanks for coming on Week in Review today. Hey, Bill, happy to be here. Glad to have you all here. By the way, you can watch us live. By the way, David Kroman, are you with us?
Yeah, I can hear you in a sort of echoey chamber.
No, okay. Well, we'll work on the chamber echoiness while our show's going. We're going to try to fix this plan.
the solution to that is don't gather. The governor has said that we're not supposed. Hear me, Paige. Yeah. Oh, sorry. So Paige, what I was saying is that we have this. You and I were talking before the show about folks they're going to get tested. They're ostensibly trying to do the right thing. We have a messaging issue. Uh-huh. Carolyn, any reaction?
Yes, so I agree with Paige. It's really it's really frustrating and difficult, I think, for people to hear completely different messages coming out of the governor's office and then local politicians because, you know, I really feel as though officials have been tiptoeing around saying just stay home, cancel your plans. Like it's very clear to me that people are not responsible enough to take this seriously. And, this rush on testing, quite frankly, is too little too late. Nobody, I think, is quarantined probably appropriately. And I can only anticipate a sharp spike after Thanksgiving, which is frightening and quite frankly, like just sort of an almost impossible scenario to visualize because we're in this so badly and so deeply already. I mean, health experts are predicting that we're going to see upwards of 150 hospitalizations per day throughout the state if we continue along this trajectory. And the fact that people are still planning to get together for Thanksgiving does not bode well.
Carolyn, are you also saying that you'd like to see more enforcement of these rules?
Yes, but the problem is that, how do I put this? So, yes, but of course, the difficulty of enforcement is that the governor's office keeps on panning it off to local law enforcement. That's what they said to me when I asked anyway. They said that enforcement is up to local law enforcement. And as we know, more vulnerable communities have a history of being over policed. Like the police, more closely rather watch these communities. And so it's more likely that communities of color and communities that are vulnerable in other ways will probably more materially suffer the consequences of any sort of enforcement action, that comes in the form of financial penalties, for instance. And the fact that the governor isn't bothering to enact active enforcement for larger gatherings in places like churches, for instance, that are currently only allowed up to 200 people, or I think 20 to 25% capacity. I can't remember exactly which number, but whichever is lower. Nobody's going in and checking to make sure that these religious gatherings are actually, at max capacity and that they're all masked. So I think it's just more tragedy waiting to happen, quite frankly.
I want to check in with David Kroman. I know we had some technical issues. David, are you able to hear me and the other guests now?
Yes, I can now.
You can. Okay.
Yeah.
I think that was a yes. Okay, so I know we had an echoey issue. Let me just go to you. We're waiting and hoping to hear more from the governor about financial aid. Why we're way into this pandemic? Why are we just now trying to find out whether we can get this financial assistance together?
Yeah, my sense is there was probably some optimism earlier in the summer when it looked like Congress was going to pass another round of stimulus. And I think that a lot of the country probably expected that after the sort of resounding success of the CARES Act and its ability to rescue the economy, that Congress would come back and do another round. And that would really help states like Washington. That, of course, has not happened. And so, maybe you could fault the governor, and some people have, for not being more prepared for the second wave or third wave or whatever we want to call it. But at this point, the state, I think, if the state decides it wants to push out more money to people, the governor is going to have to call the legislature back into session because, he has some authority and some money that he can push out on his own. He is putting out another $50 million to help people, which is, in the grand scheme of things, not that much. But if they want to really put a lot of weight behind getting a lot of money out the door very quickly, the legislature is going to have to step in. And so that, we're waiting to see if he's going to call them in early or just kind of wait until January when the session was scheduled to convene anyway.
Yeah, and
why? Yes, go ahead, Paige.
I would say on the issue of messaging again, like I talked about, the governor is facing an issue of a COVID-19 pandemic and also an economic pandemic. We're having two major issues happening at the same time. And I think people are really frustrated now that Governor Inslee hasn't come out ahead on the economic side as hard as he's been messaging on wear your masks, stay home, setting new restrictions in place. And David makes a good point. Maybe we were waiting on the federal government to bail us out. And without that happening, some of that blame is going to Inslee now.
And granted, the amount that Washington state individually would be able to get to people compared to what the federal government would be able to get to people is a lot less. So in the grand scheme of things, if the CARES Act by all measures did wonders to kind of rescue the economy from falling into a free fall. But the only reason it could really do that is because we're talking in the order of trillions of dollars going out. Washington is facing a fairly dire financial situation and is not going to be able to push out trillions of dollars. So what money would get pushed out would certainly be helpful to the people who get it. But if you're talking in the world of sort of fundamental alteration to the economy and something sort of as impactful as the CARES Act, it really does probably need to come from the federal government.
Yeah, I was going to mention that. I mean, $50 million might be nothing in the grand scheme of things, but certainly quite a bit for Washington State, particularly particularly given the financial situation we're facing. And I do have to give Inslee props for actually being able to find that money. I mean, these are not easy times economically for anybody, and given what the future holds financially, even post-vaccine, it's pretty bad and pretty frightening. And I think that a lot of people are going to be out of work and very poor for a long time.
I was doing a little troubleshooting. Did we explain why Inslee would not call a special session? He's been asked to do that for a long time.
He's been asked to do that for a long time. And I don't know exactly. I mean, I think part of it is a lot of what he was doing from the public health standpoint. The justification was, I mean, that stuff needed to happen quickly. And so it needed to happen through executive action. The question of financial, stuff that could help the economy, though, it is harder for the governor to just do that from an executive standpoint. So I don't know. I mean, I think it would mean he would have to reckon with Republican opposition and moderate Democrat opposition to certain, large scale initiatives or things like that. But I'm not sure at this point.
Okay, one more. I'll describe an issue here. Maybe we can just stick with my audio instead of the double audio for a moment. I started with the idea that you're not supposed to get a test. Please don't get a test if you're not sick or exposed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's one more please don't, and that has to do with the stockpiling. The division president of Safeway and Albertsons, Carl Schroeder, says there's enough toilet paper for everyone unless you clear it off the shelf.
Do you mind if I take this one?
Go for it.
Thanks. I think we're playing.
Except people do buy more than they need, which is why a lot of stores are limiting you to 1 pack of Clorox wipes, et cetera, at a time. Carolyn, did you have something to say about this?
I absolutely have such to say about this. So first off, the reason that we were in such a predicament in March and everything like that is because people were doing this. They were going to Costco. We saw the huge lines at places like Costco, at Safeway. The store shelves were bare. They were completely empty. And as frustrating as this is for a lot of people, it's actually deadly for, and I don't say that with any sort of exaggeration, it is actually deadly for a lot of vulnerable folks who rely on places like senior centers or on food banks to get food to eat and basic necessities. You can joke about how, you're not going to die without toilet paper, but you certainly will die without food. And a lot of people in March, I was hearing from senior centers, places like the Southeast Seattle Senior Center, which I'm pretty connected to through my reporting, we're having really big problems finding enough food to continue their meal programs for the seniors who relied on those meal programs, the meal programs that are continuing now and have expanded. And from food banks who were also seeing supply issues and really worrying about where they were going to get the food to feed the people who do rely on them. And this is particularly a problem in, of course, South King County, which I mainly cover, where there are a lot of low income and vulnerable folks who, again, rely on these places for food and basic necessities. And so I honestly, when I was hearing that people were once again doing this ridiculous hoarding thing, I couldn't help but think, that we have apparently learned nothing, and that we are going to continue to be selfish unless people routinely call out other folks for doing this and say, please stop, consider your behavior and how it affects other people. So basically, I'm here, I'm going to say it, don't hoard, don't be selfish, because you might actually kill somebody because they won't have enough food because of your actions.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, we see this because people are freaked out, rightfully so. I mean, the coronavirus case numbers are skyrocketing, hospitalizations are skyrocketing. We're going into this semi-lockdown, and people have all these reasons to freak out. So maybe they're finding some comfort in knowing, okay, I have all these physical belongings around me, I have all of the food I need. So I can sort of understand where they're coming from. But you're absolutely right. People should not be hoarding groceries, not even toilet paper. We've got to let this spread out for the long run. And the grocers have said there's not a supply shortage, no reason to panic. But you just wonder if people want some comfort knowing I've got what I need.
Okay, I want to bring up one more thing, that the fact that you're not flying for Thanksgiving, as we were talking about earlier, made this next item more underwhelming than it otherwise might have been. After being grounded for nearly 2 years after a couple of deadly crashes, this week the FAA signed off on letting the Boeing 737 MAX fly again. That's a big deal, except last time I checked, only one airline has placed the MAX back on its flight schedule. American has a 737 MAX scheduled to fly on one route, Miami to New York, on December 29th, when we're likely going to be under a no-fly order. Any reaction from my panelists to the MAX clearance that we heard about this week?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of stories that would be enormous stories in any other year, and this was an enormous story when it first happened. Such it is as it is, we I think have sort of forgotten about the 737 MAX, but worth remembering that Boeing was talking about bringing this MAX back, almost I think a year ago at this point. They were saying, well, I think by the end of the year we'd have certification. And so a year later, it's just finally when they are in fact getting certification for this thing. I would say that as far as Boeing's troubles go, this is a good step for them, obviously, to clear this hurdle, but it is not the end. It is possibly the beginning of the end for them, because they have just been brutalized through this whole process as reporters, especially here in Seattle, have looked into lax safety practices, have uncovered things that actually don't have anything to do with the 737 MAX, but were other issues. And so they're going to have a lot of reputation rebuilding to do, not to mention bringing the 737 MAX back at this point when the entire global airline industry is basically, I think it's 25% of normal capacity. So I'm sure that Boeing is happy with this turnaround, but it's starting to feel like it's just kind of a drop in the bucket of their larger problems.
I also wanted to mention that I think that with regards to Boeing's future, it's way too early to make any predictions, because, I mean, if you step back and think about it, this particular economy is driven by demand, and that demand right now is, and that specific kind of demand is heavily dependent on people actually going places, which isn't really happening right now for the most part. And we also have yet to see the full economic repercussions, into the future. Again, even as the vaccine becomes available to folks, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody will get it all at once, and so we can just jump into the air. That's not how it works. And while I'm certain that Americans and Brits, for instance, will be champing at the bit to go places. There are other cultures, other folks from countries with different cultures whose values, who actually value the whole instead of the individual. And they'll be more circumspect about traveling places and potentially infecting other people, unlike Americans or Brits. And, I think that that's going to dictate in large part what happens with regards to the 737 being, commissioned for or by other airlines, and how many are commissioned. I mean, I think really all that we can say with confidence right now is that the plane is allegedly safe to go up into the sky again, and then everything else is proverbially up in the air.
Paige Browning,
See, can you hear me?
I hear you now.
Okay, good. The thing that I see is exactly what you just said. Can Boeing convince people that this is going to be safe? We heard our representative Rick Larson say, who's on the aviation subcommittee in Congress, say this week that, hey, once these are cleared to fly and once they're I'm able to book a ticket, I'll get on one of these. We know that the FAA chair has said that he's flown one of these. But I still am waiting to see, does the public trust that this plane is actually safe? That's going to make a big difference.
And it hasn't gotten certification in Europe, as far as I know. And some places are demanding. So there's this sort of wonky thing about the sensor, the faulty sensor, and they only had one before. Now in the United States, it has 2 sensors, but in some places they're demanding that it have 3 sensors. So, FAA clearing it doesn't necessarily remove all the hurdles for flying or basing out of other parts of the world, which is obviously still a big part of their business. But yeah, you mentioned Rick Larson, the representative up there, reminded me that locally probably the bigger problem is less about the 737 MAX and more about the 787, the wing production, which is now appearing to be moving entirely to South Carolina, even after years and years of massive tax breaks to Boeing. So just as far as Boeing and travel related issues on a local level, the 737 MAX's certification is now just one of many.
Right.
All right. So to wrap up the 737 MAX this week, we got the FAA announcement that they've cleared it, but we've got pilot training, planes being inspected, the software fix to be installed, regulators around the world signing off. Meanwhile, there's a criminal probe, the U.S. Justice Department looking into this. Congress is debating tightening the FAA's authority over Boeing employees who get essentially deputized by the agency to sign off on designs. So just an incremental step, a major one from the FAA this week. We are going to continue with the Week in Review. What happened this week and what does it mean? Our next topic, what happened to defunding? We got some news along those lines this week when we continue on the Week in Review with KUOW's Paige Browning, Crosscut's David Kroman, and South Seattle Emerald's Carolyn Bick. We'll be right back.
It's KUOW's Week in Review on 94.9 and worldwide. You can listen on the web at KUOW.org.
Support for KUOW comes from King Conservation District, helping to empower residents to build a more climate-resilient King County by offering education, resources, and access to native plants for the home and garden through their Native Plant Fair. More at kingcd.org. Helping build better ground.
Expect some sun this afternoon, a high near 51. It's currently cloudy and 49 at 12:31.
For a lot of expectant mothers, when this pandemic hit, hospitals started looking less and less appealing.
Suddenly, it just hit us like a tsunami. The home birth community became completely swamped.
I'm Kai Rizdal, Home Births. Who's choosing them and why? Next time on Marketplace at 2:30 and 6:30 p.m. on KUOW 94.9 and KUOW.org.
And now Week in Review continues on KUOW.
This is Bill Radke with Crosscut's David Kroman, South Seattle Emerald's Carolyn Bick, KUOW's own Paige Browning. I think we've got our audio issues worked out. And you even got visuals when you go to Facebook or YouTube, and you can find us by searching KUOW Public Radio. So, continuing with the news of the week, this summer, the Seattle City Council was talking about defunding the police. Some council members said they would vote to cut SPD's budget by 50%. This week, the City Council voted to let the department hire more police officers. Councilmember Lisa Herbold said she doesn't want to jeopardize investigations into human trafficking and other crimes.
I am concerned about that a hiring freeze will result in a reduction from specialty units that are actually serving an important purpose at this time.
Well, we had important human trafficking investigators 5 months ago. Who wants to start and tell us why they are now a reason to hire more police officers?
The Seattle City Council what they're seeing, and was made fairly clearly earlier this summer, is they can control the budget. They can cut budget. They can make it so that the Seattle Police Department would be able to hire fewer people. But what they can't do is tell the chief of police which people to hire and to fire. That is the job of the chief of police. And so, it was made fairly clear over the summer, it was made fairly clear that the new chief, interim chief Diaz, was going to prioritize patrol pretty much over everything else. He moved 100 people out of specialty units onto patrol. So the frontline people who are in cars, and, if you call 911, the people who are going to show up. He said explicitly, this is where our priorities lie. So, the Seattle City Council, not all of them, but most of them, are sort of hoping to make more precision cuts, move things from here, build up things over here. But by cutting, if they were to cut positions or the budget for positions from the Seattle Police Department, they have no control over where the chief makes those cuts. And so their concern is that if they were to make these cuts and sort of keep this hiring freeze in place, Chief Diaz would take away from the things that they like, domestic violence unit, cyber crimes unit, things like that, and put those people onto patrol. And so therefore sort of doing the opposite of what they actually want to do. And so that is what Councilmember Herbold is talking about, and probably why we are not going to see sort of as dramatic cuts next year as maybe some people were expecting.
Yeah, my only thing to add to that is this was a summer of talking about defunding the police, and city council members came out saying that, really kind of backing that call and saying they were going to support, vocally saying they'd support defunding up to 50%. And then when it came time for, the rubber to hit the road, if you will, and they actually were building the budget, I think they faced some realities of how is this going to work with labor negotiations? How is this going to work with working alongside the mayor, which they're doing a bit more of, I would say, now than over the summer. So this is something that people who have been activists on the issue are going to be really upset about, and are upset about, because they had some lip service from the city council that they were going to get these cuts. So just my view on that.
Why is the city council aligning more with Mayor Durkin so much lately? David, you can either answer the question you began to answer, or the one that I just asked. But Paige brought up that there seems to be more unity between the city council and the mayor than before.
Yeah, I think that not among the whole council, but I think among a majority of the council, there is a desire to. I think they were spending a lot of time and energy and political capital on this kind of fight with the mayor, and I just don't think a lot of them have the energy to keep going with that, the mayor included. I think she has probably moved some towards the council as well. But one thing that I think and that the council realized was the extent to which, if they were going to make cuts, that was going to come directly out of personnel. I think when they first started this conversation, they had the impression that they could make more cuts to things like equipment and things like overtime, and then realized that money was spent. That was gone. There was no cutting from that. So if you're cutting 50% of the Seattle Police Department's budget, you're actually probably going to cut more than 50% of the staff because all the other kind of more discretionary stuff was gone. So that complicated things. And then, yeah, as Paige mentioned, the labor side of this is a really big deal and really difficult. And the fact is the systems that they are imagining that would take the place of the police department only exist in sort of what one person described to me as, boutique examples. There are small things around the city and the county that sort of could serve to be a minor supplement to what the Seattle Police Department does, but they are not in any way scaled up. And I think that probably to a certain extent, the headlines about Seattle City Council are going to cut 50% of the budget were overplayed in the summer. I think what we actually saw was some kind of vague expression of support for that idea, but without any kind of timeline to it. I think there were, Councilmember Shama Sawant was ready to cut 50% of the budget. She in fact introduced a proposal to do that, but it didn't go anywhere. Whereas most of the rest of the council, I think, is really what they were kind of trying to say, probably not very gracefully, was we want to work towards a system in which 50% of the police department is no longer relevant, which is a much different thing to say, I am ready to cut 50% of the police department tomorrow.
Couple more things on policing, Paige. This week, plaintiffs in a federal lawsuit said Seattle police have continued to use crowd control weapons in ways that violate a court order. Would you explain that for us?
Yeah, this is basically what this is about is, as people will remember, over the summer, a judge put a temporary ban, a temporary injunction, as they're called, on police sort of indiscriminately using crowd control weapons like tear gas on protesters. Those weapons were used multiple times after that injunction was put in place. And so now the ACLU and lawyers representing Black Lives Matter, Seattle and King County say, Judge, you need to hold the city accountable because they just violated the ban on weapons that we all agreed to, a temporary ban that is. So where we are this week and this month is that the city of Seattle and then the ACLU and Black Lives Matter are kind of arguing over, did this violation actually happen? The city is saying, this is their argument, which I find is interesting, is the city says maybe some officers used tear gas or blast balls or other devices, but that doesn't mean that the city can be held responsible. That means that those officers can be held responsible individually. So that's where it stands now.
Okay. Any other comment on that before I roll on? Carol, the city. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say that order, that initial order, was always fairly Swiss cheesy. It had there were a lot of caveats to it, which was, we're banning these less than lethal weapons, unless, and then there was a fairly large list of unlesses. You've tried everything else. You've targeted that non-lethal weapon. They were still allowed to use some of these. It was just supposed to be in a targeted manner. So then you get into the sort of nuance of like what's targeted and what's not. So I don't know what the judge is going to conclude, but from the beginning, I don't think that this order was ever as blanket as maybe it was interpreted to be.
Okay. Now, Carolyn, the city of Seattle has been debating for years how to reform the police department. So overall, will you catch us up on where that stands?
Right. So in my view, I don't actually see a lot of active reform going on aside from the highly publicized, as we just talked about, the highly publicized debate over defunding and, the successful ish shift in certain roles of police officers over the summer and, just yesterday. But there was also an issue that came up in the course of the protests that I wrote about back in September, and that was a fairly, demonstrable case that could be replicated. That the SPD and therefore the city is out of compliance with the consent decree, at least appears to be out of compliance with the consent decree. The long and the short of it, and it's tremendously complicated, but the long and the short of it is that a local journalist alleges that an officer threw a blast ball underneath her. This caused permanent hearing loss, and by the SPD's manual and as mandated by the consent decree, her case should therefore be reviewed by a special board within SPD, but it wasn't, and it won't be under the way the manual is written and the way that the Office of Police Accountability's processes currently go, basically. Earlier this week, I published a story which was kind of a follow-up because the heads of OIG and OPA wrote a letter to federal oversight officials and to Interim Chief Diaz that suggested that they appeared to agree that the SPD and therefore the city are operating out of compliance with the consent decree. But what was fascinating to me is that they really seemed to take pains to avoid saying that outright, despite the fact that there's nothing barring them from saying it appears that the SPD and therefore the city are out of compliance with the consent decree. And I thought it was very fascinating and kind of telling about how much power the SPD really wields in the city, and by extension, the Seattle Police Officers Guild. So I don't know if there's going to be any sort of internal reform, and I don't know if we're going to see anything beyond just a lot of talk.
David, I heard you.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to note on that is that actually, I mean, the Seattle Police Department is out of compliance with the consent decree. Like a year and a half ago, the judge basically said that the systems designed to hold officers accountable were not doing that. And so therefore he was finding them out of compliance with the consent decree. So, this case, I think that, could probably be seen as an example for why that conclusion was made. But the city is still kind of in the process of trying to figure out how it convinces the judge that its system for holding officers accountable should be in line with the federal requirements put into place. And until then, the police department will be out of compliance with the consent decree.
I'm looking at the clock, and we still have to cross the West Seattle Bridge when we come to it. Any more thoughts on the police issue as part of the bigger city budget talks? Any final words on what we should know about the city's budget talks, which I think really kick into another gear next week? But what should we know? And then we're gonna rumble toward West Seattle.
Grand scheme of things, the city is pretty lucky. I mean, this could have been a lot worse. They passed this new tax on large businesses. They got a slightly better than expected financial forecast. Voters recently passed a new tax to fund bus service. So it's clearly not a good year financially, but all of those things combined mean that for the city of Seattle, compared to I think a lot of cities across the country, is not in as bad of a place this year, at least for right now, as it will be, as a lot of other places are.
Okay, Paige, any other notes on city budget, or did we do it?
I mean, I would just say we talked about police reform and some of the things in their proposal. The city council did decide that they are going to allow new police hiring next year. They're not going to cut that in the budget, but something to watch is there are some smaller items, 10 or 20 smaller items that will change the police department in small ways. So there's that.
Okay. More to come on the city budget. One more question before we leave it. There was one of the arguments against the business tax that Seattle is now seems like it's depending on that revenue coming in. An argument was that businesses would leave or not hire because of it. I think this is the third time this show I've said, well, the pandemic, it makes it hard to assess that. But is there any evidence yet of the tax hurting the Seattle economy, or do we just, in the middle of this chaos, we have no idea?
I mean, it hasn't been implemented yet, so nobody's paying the tax yet.
But the warning that there was going to be
Right.
less hiring because of it, or the businesses were going to pull up stakes. That too early to tell.
I think probably too early to tell, especially like you said, it's hard to know what's pandemic, what's not. Amazon is building more on the east side. Why that is, is a little unclear. Might be space, might be some of the political environment. But I would say it's too early to tell if this is going to have a negative impact.
I think so too. And I think what I'll be watching for once this goes into effect is there legal action against this city law? I'm thinking Amazon or maybe another big company.
Right.
So I'll be watching for that. And just a side note that I found interesting, Amazon's tax director is actually on the Joe Biden transition team. Fun fact.
Amazon's tax director is on the Biden transition team. What does that suggest to you?
I don't know what it suggests. Maybe something about Biden's taxation priorities, but I know that's not related to what we were talking about. I just find it kind of a fun fact and something that progressives have pointed out as something that they did not agree to.
Yeah.
Yes, the ongoing inter-democratic contest as we watch Biden appoint people and and by the way, try to actually become president after an election that he won. Okay, let's put that on pause and repair or replace and what's making you smile when we return on the Week in Review. We'll be right back.
It's 1248, 94.9 KUOW. Online, listen live at KUOW.org. We should see a partly sunny afternoon, according to the National Weather Service, with a high around 51 degrees. Currently, still cloudy and 49 in Seattle's University District.
Support for KUOW comes from the Association of Washington Business Health Choice Trust, providing a wide variety of health care plans for small and mid-sized businesses through Premera Blue Cross. Learn more at ProPointServices.com.
For many expectant mothers, when the pandemic began, hospitals started looking less and less appealing. Home births, who's choosing them and why? That's coming up at 2:30 on Marketplace.
Support for KUOW comes from the Pike Place Market. The market is open and celebrating fall, from pumpkin spice lattes and apple pie treats to shopping for fall table decor. Masks required and safety measures are in place. More at pikeplacemarket.org, where Seattle eats, shops, meets, and rejuvenates.
And now Week in Review continues on KUOW.
This is Bill Radke. Our Week in Review panel this week is the South Seattle Emerald's Carolyn Bick, Crosscut's David Kroman, and KUOW's Paige Browning, which I didn't have to tell you if you're watching us on YouTube or Facebook, because you can see us all there. You find us there by searching KUOW Public Radio. Okay, so one of Seattle's most heavily used roadways has been closed since March because of the cracking, and the city's been studying and debating how to get cars over it again. Seattle's Mayor Jenny Durkan had been considering things like replacing 3 concrete sections with steel arches and supports. She said that might take 5 years, including the federal grant applications and the environmental permits. This week, the mayor said, no, let's just fix what we've got. We'll do the repair option. We can get cars over it again, maybe in summer of 2022. Now, I spoke to the editor of the West Seattle blog, and I got the impression that this is the most popular option in West Seattle to get this thing going sooner rather than later. But we were starting to talk about this before the show. Is there any significant opposition to this decision to repair the West Seattle Bridge instead of more of a replace option? Who wants to begin?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't seen a ton of opposition to it. The most vocal has been the King County Labor Council, and which, for one, the Labor Council is basically always in favor of large construction projects because it puts their union members to work. So I think for them, the bigger the better. But more importantly, their argument, which I think has some logic to it, is industry in Seattle is never going to get any smaller than it is now. Not to say it's small now, but it's just going to keep growing. So if they put off repairing this bridge for 15 years, in 15 years, it's going to be harder to replace because in theory, Seattle will have continued to grow and it will be an even more important corridor than it is right now. But as the West Seattle blog editor noted, I think on balance, the repair option is the most popular because cheapest for now, fastest to get it moving again, and kind of reserves the conversation around should that corridor be as car heavy as it is? Is there some way that it can be rebuilt so that it's more centered around, light rail? Can they coordinate with Sound Transit? Better transit access, better, foot and pedestrian bike access, that sort of thing. And so I think by repairing it, those conversations are probably going to be a little more robust, which is pleasing to a kind of more urbanist crowd who want to see the city move away from a car-centric vision for transportation.
Yeah, I think David kind of hit what we know of for opposition to this. There were few people this week, at least, speaking out that they want a full replacement. And one of the reasons, well, a couple of the reasons, West Seattle, as the blog reporter told you this week, Bill, has basically become like a quote unquote peninsula. It's an island, and
Yes.
they didn't ask for that. West Seattleites are sick of the commute taking so long. And here's a bigger one to me, that some of the neighborhoods that the cars are now going through, South Park, have historically had horrible transit and transportation access, and they are now carrying a bigger burden. So they're trying to help some of the communities that were carrying this load by putting a Band-Aid on it instead of putting in a new bridge.
Carolyn, anything to add?
I think David and Paige pretty much well covered it. I do think it's also important to note that the city can only put out so many fires at once, so it's very hard for me to see anybody trying to argue for a complete replace option, particularly since that would take until 2026.
Yes. And again, as is the requirement on this edition of Week in Review, I have to say, but the pandemic. Like, imagine if all this had happened when rush hour was what rush hour used to be.
Right. I mean, there's never a good time for a bridge like that to go down. But if there is, I suppose now is the good time because there are fewer people commuting than there used to be.
Right.
Also, I would think if I'm the city, I would want to try and get as much of this work done now as possible before people start returning to their offices. So, the repair option, you figure we're at least until the summer before people are commuting at anything close to what it was before the pandemic. So that gives the city a good, 7, 8 months of head start on this repair before they're really dealing with a traffic rush.
I actually disagree that now was the best time for the bridge to go down rather than in non-pandemic conditions, because in non-pandemic conditions, we would have had much more cash to try to not only to try to get this rolling more quickly, but to potentially even somehow figure out alternative options.
True.
But because we have to put out the said fire, the pandemic that I just mentioned, we have so significantly less cash, and so much less cash that it's as we already talked about, it's a pretty grim financial future for a lot of people. And I think that not having this bridge during this grim financial future, when people are already losing their jobs, means that even more people will be financially ruined in the future. So now is not the best time for this to happen. I would argue it's the worst.
Yeah, fair
and
enough.
It's happening at a time when people aren't wanting to get on transit, which is one way to get around.
Yes.
And that is part of this. Durkin has said that, we're going to spend this amount of money fixing the bridge, and we're going to spend this amount of money for other options to get to West Seattle and South Park. Personally, I hope that means some more routes on the West Seattle water taxi, because those things fill up.
Yes.
And to Carolyn's point, the odds that I think that the odds that a lot of money is coming from the federal government to help fix this problem are probably worse right now, in part because of the pandemic happening and the government is so tied up with other things, or not doing other things.
Okay, we have just enough time to work in a smile before we go. Mine is that the Seahawks are undefeated at Lumen Field. The Seahawks Stadium changed names again yesterday. You know, it was Seahawks Stadium, and then it went corporate with Quest Field. People said, "Oh, too corporate." And then CenturyLink bought Quest Communications, so it was CenturyLink Field. And they said, "Oh, we kind of like Quest Field. We don't like CenturyLink as a name." Now CenturyLink is rebranding itself, so the field is called Lumen Field, and people are saying, "Oh, we love the name CenturyLink so much." But I really hope Seahawk fans will be saying from now on Sundays that they're going to the Lou. Is there anything that made you smile this week?
Sure, I'll start.
2 minutes of smiling.
All right, 2 minutes of smiling.
That's
I will
it.
make it less than 2 minutes.
Yeah.
The long and the short of it is that my husband is a wonderful, amazing person, and I love him.
Yay.
I
Awesome.
love that.
Wow, my wife is going to be bummed when I don't say that. I was going to say the vaccine is looking highly effective, and there is early data that suggests immunity lasts for a very long time. So I would say, as far as the holidays go, we should be able to kind of buckle down and sacrifice a little more, knowing that come spring, summer, the odds have never been better that vaccine will actually have an impact and help us get this genuinely under control.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, mine, Bill, is I'm not always that great at planning ahead when it comes to, say, groceries, events, etc. But I did this time. I got all my groceries for Thanksgiving to make 3 pies, and I'm going to do it. This is how many pies I'd be making if my whole family got together. Which
Right.
is not going to happen. But I'm doing it anyway. I'm going to make an apple, a pumpkin, and maple pecan. Taking recipe ideas if anyone has them. So
Lovely.
I got all the ingredients before actually last weekend. So I'm set.
How do we get those to you? On Twitter?
Send them
On,
to me on
your
Twitter.
email?
Yeah, at
Yeah.
Paige Reports. Give me the recipes, especially maple pecan bourbon, I hear is a variety. So
Yes.
hit me up.
We switched
Hey.
from pumpkin to sweet potato in recent years, and I'm never going back.
I was saying to my wife, maybe we could just skip the feast since we're going to be a small group, and just have crab legs. But I'm not sure what we're.
That's probably more typical of what they were actually eating, back in the 1800s. Crab legs.
Right. Hey, we got to go. I'm thankful and smiling at all of you. Thank you for riding through this with us. My team, my panel of super journalists, Crosscut's David Kroman, KUOW's Paige Browning, South Seattle Emerald's Carolyn Bick. Thanks to all of you. Have a great Thanksgiving safely.
Thanks, Bill.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you for tuning in.
everyone.
We'll see you again next week. By the way, our visualization there on YouTube and Facebook, that's Juan Pablo Chiquiza and Tio Popescu bringing you that. Sarah Leibovitz